Welcome to another edition of 5 Questions in 5 Minutes, where we talk to leaders in their field. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have a true leader from their field, Major General Charles Vyvyan, CBE, retired British Army officer, not any British Army officer. He served as head of the British Defence Staff and Defence Attaché in Washington, and Gentleman Usher of the Scarlet Rod, to which we will return, but I will dive straight in with the first of our 5 questions. And if I may be so cliched as to say, you are indeed the very model of a modern British Major General. Is that the Gilbert and Sullivan? When we met up, Charles, we briefly discussed leadership, because you're also chairman of, or have been chairman, I think, of 3 British companies. And we discussed leadership in our brief conversation when we thought, should we do this interview? And I remember you discussing the idea that the army had possibly created an infrastructure to ensure everyone can succeed. And I wondered if you might elaborate a little bit on that, because there was a notion that it might potentially impede exceptional talent. And the other thought was how any of that relates to business, as you've seen it, if I may.
Yeah, Paul, thank you. No, I think it's a very good point you've raised. Obviously, there will be occasions when there will be immediate requirements for leadership, and leadership will be shown. But for sustained leadership, it needs an infrastructure to support it, so that it knows that whatever it does, it will be capable of achieving the aim. The army has constructed and refined its infrastructure over 300 or more years, so that it has an ability to sustain a leadership over during whatever the requirements may happen to be. The point you make is that whoever is thrown into the mix at any one stage, whether he is highly successful or not, the system will ensure that as far as possible, he can be supported in the achievement of his aim, so that he will not himself, if he's able, have to contribute as much as somebody who is much more able would be able to do, but the aim would still be achieved. As regards the crossover into civilian life, I believe that the leaders in civilian life are the real leaders of today, because they have to create this infrastructure, not necessarily from scratch, but certainly they have to create it so that the infrastructure knows what it is attempting to achieve, and that the leader will be able to achieve it with their support. But he doesn't inherit anything at all. He's really responsible for creating it and making sure that it's sustainable. And there, I think, is greatest demands put upon leaders.
Do you think in any sense the converse is true, in that business will allow you to fail if failing is best for the business?
Well, I think the shareholders and others will decide that. Yes, certainly. And obviously, if you can't succeed and you're not able to construct the infrastructure and use the infrastructure to succeed, then yes, I think you will be removed quite sharply. And it may be said it happens in the army as well, and it has happened in my areas of command where people have been removed.
Right, yeah. Another thing we touched on briefly was the idea that the Falklands War might never have been won without the troubles in Northern Ireland having occurred. Could you explain what your thinking was there?
Well, I think any organization has to adapt, has to change. Any organization which is the same size and shape and thinking in the same way after 40 years is probably going down the tubes. And I think the army, when I joined it in the middle 60s, was very much a Second World War army. It hadn't changed, because actually in democracies, it's very difficult to change armies in peacetime because the money is taken away because there's no immediate threat. I think Northern Ireland produced a catalyst for rethinking what the army was able to do and what it had to be able to do.
I know you have huge experience in or you have some experience at least, but in counterinsurgency. And I wonder if you're able to tell us a little bit about that experience in counterinsurgency, what you've learned from that field.
Well, I wouldn't say I have a huge experience. I have some experience, principally in the Middle East and Northern Ireland. And I think the main thing I've learned, and it was a process of learning, is that internal security and counterinsurgency are not really military operations with a civilian input. They are civilian operations with a military input. And that, I think, is not understood sufficiently, because people feel that wherever there is violence, then it must be a military response. That's not exactly true. Violence very usually, in my experience, usually is a symptom of a civilian situation, not a cause of it. And usually it is a matter of governance, which is very much a civilian responsibility.
On a lighter note, Charles, can I ask you, do you have an all-time favorite book or writer? And if so, why is that your choice?
Well, I think inevitably one's views change. But the classics will always be the classics, and they will always be fun to read as you actually read them again and get to know them better. But of a more modern book, which I enjoy, and I read probably every 5 years, is the Sword of Honor trilogy by Evelyn Waugh. Because not only is it beautifully written, but it's also a very human saga about people with whom I can associate myself, and with situations with which I can associate myself.
What exactly, Charles, is the gentleman usher of the Scarlet Rod?
Well, I think he's actually Gentleman Usher of the Order of the Bath, but we'll set that aside. He's known as Scarlet Rod because he carries a wand of office which has a bit of scarlet in it. But all the orders of chivalry have a Gentleman Usher. Black Rod, whom you will be more familiar with, is the Gentleman Usher of the Order of the Garter, for instance. And there's one for the Order of the Thistle and the Order of St. Michael and St. George. It is one of the 6 officers who are really responsible for the order. The Order of the Bath was recreated by George I in 1725, and it is really to reward military officers or the military and increasingly the civilian servants of the government. But it's a part of the pageantry of British society. It doesn't have to exist, but the fact it does exist, I think, is probably assists in the gaiety of the nation.
Well, I'm sort of struck in the way you answered that question, and indeed in the way you've answered many questions, if I may say so, by the humility you show given all the things you've achieved. And I wondered if I could finish by asking, are you, and I don't know whether pride is the right word, but what of all the things you've achieved in your life so far, what is the one you are most proud of, or that you think back with the most, well, pride is the word I keep coming to, so I'll go with that.
Well, I wouldn't regard it as pride, and I think what I'd like to feel where my contribution has been greatest is actually where I have no idea whether it was effective or not, and that is in the development of the individual as a person rather than his development as a soldier. I spent 35 years with the military in various different places and uniforms, and so I can't really judge whether or not I was successful, but I was always very well aware that the individuals one had the privilege of commanding or leading were actually, first of all, individual people, and only secondly were they soldiers.
Major General Charles Vyvyan, I am very, very grateful to you indeed. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Incredibly insightful. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much for your time.